Welcome to KnotWork Storytelling. This is the show where we untangle our myths and reweave our stories, one age-old tale at a time. I'm your host and lead storyteller, Marisa Gowdy. I'm a myth worker, a story healer, a coach for writers and creative entrepreneurs, and the author of The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. If you love what you hear and want to support the show, I'd be so grateful if you'd become a paid subscriber on Substack. In my newsletter, Myth is Medicine, you'll receive bonus content related to the stories on the show and deep dives into how mythology and folklore can help heal the individual and the collective in the present moment and beyond. There's a link in the show notes to follow Myth is Medicine on Substack, or visit mythismedicine.substack.com. Season 5, Episode 13, Remembering a Goddess 3 Years On. Before we explore this week's story, I have a question for you. What about your stories? Whether it's a book project that wants to be birthed, deep, authentic writing to support your business, or a personal creative project you can't quite name yet, I'm here to support your process and help you get your words onto the page and into the world. I work with folks who are writing memoirs, chronicles of the spiritual journey, and books that explore healing in the imagination, even as they explore the toughest truths of life. I support entrepreneurs, especially coaches and therapists in private practice, who wish to weave their personal experiences with their professional knowledge and wisdom. Do you want to build a writing practice and develop the ideas you know you must share? I invite you to visit my brand new website, writingcoachmarisa.com, to learn more about my services and to set up a free 30-minute consultation. I would love to talk with you about your stories. 3 years ago, I was sitting at my equinox fire in the backyard. The sun had just set. The full moon was rising over the trees. And I heard a voice. Now, you might say that voice came from a spirit guide. You might say that it came from the depths of the collective creative imagination. You might say that I was merely hearing things. But what I heard was a name, Mongfind. And what I heard was that she was the voice of the interrupted feminine. And what I heard was that it was up to me to write the stories of the guides, gods, and ancestors. I heard that KnotWork Storytelling was a title to give the new project. And so, in rather a mystical moment, the idea for a podcast was born. And a few months later, the following in bulk, I started the show. And so I'm thinking about Mongfind on this 3-year anniversary, and I want to honor her. And I want to recognize all the ways in which her myth continues to work on me, and the ways in which I am called to keep working her myth. And so I've been trying for days and weeks, and I still cannot unsnarl the story. That's the beautiful danger of naming a show KnotWork, of course. You're just as likely to run into the tangles as you are to figure out how to create a gorgeous design. So I had intended to weave for you a new story, born out of some forgotten nook or cranny of her life. I'd been trying to go back to the original tale, to light up pieces that I hadn't brought through before. I was trying to imagine other parts of the story that I hadn't given you. But for now, the stories have been told. You can go back and you can hear my story of Mongfind that's very much rooted in the original, in the very first story I told on this podcast. And then last year at Samhain in November, I told the story that I called The Last Sovereignty Goddess, which imagined Mongfind's origins. So every time I've sat down to write something for this episode for you, I've ended up rehashing the old stories and then getting all tangled up in the meaning making that I'm trying to do today. My deadline for publication has come and gone, and I keep walking the dog out in the neighborhood, trying to figure out whether I should just stop doing this altogether. And just as I had decided to quit, I took one more walk, and I decided that maybe I would sit down without a script and try again. What I'm going to do in this episode is share with you the story that I told last November. There's a chance you didn't hear it. And what I'm also going to do is give you a little bit about what it's like to be working with the myth of Mungin right now. Because like I said, I don't yet have a new story of hers to tell. And I'm not yet sure if that means that it's all been said or if it's something so tremendous I couldn't possibly distill it down to 15 or 20 minutes. I'm staying in that creative mystery. I'm allowing myself to be in that friction, as uncomfortable as it is, because it feels an awful lot like staring at a blank page, or starting over again, or recording another voice note in which I repeat myself in a slightly different way. And as a creative person with a deadline, I bet you can imagine how uncomfortable that really is. So, as I said, I'm going to share with you the story I told of her last year. But first, I want to tell you why it feels so important and so difficult to revisit her. Now, in some ways, of course, it's merely the sense that anniversaries are important. We understand this in our human minds. We celebrate them all the time. But it's also the sense that it's Mungin's time. Now, as we're just on the cusp of autumn, and right now, as I'm sitting underneath another full moon, it feels like, of course, I must bring her forth. Because such an important reason for why we do this work with myth is to honor the seasons of the year. Because we do myth incorrectly when we think it's just a bunch of human costume drama and brokering power and waiting to find out what happens on the other side of the wall of the castle. Instead, so many of our mythologies were given to us as seasonal stories. And Mungin's story in particular is a seasonal story. She's deeply associated with the time of Samhain, as you'll hear in this version of the tale. But she's also deeply associated with my version of the equinox, because I know that to work with a Celtic calendar and with these Celtic stories so many thousands of miles away from Ireland means that if I cannot go to the sacred places and I cannot feel the mists of an Irish morning on my skin, I can honor the ways in which I am held by time, and then that time is its own sort of universal. But again, it's not just about the calendar. I'm also thinking about Mungin because of what she said to me about being the voice of the interrupted feminine. And because I know that she is someone who's come to teach us something about power. Power that's understood and power that is misunderstood. Right now, it's also election season in America. And right now, we're thinking an awful lot about feminine power. Or, I should definitely correct that. We're thinking an awful lot about female power. We're thinking about the fact that we may finally at last have a woman in the White House. And for that, I'm excited. And at the same time, I also know that to elect Kamala Harris does not necessarily get us any closer to a definition of feminine power that I'm comfortable with. At least twice on the biggest stages, she has promised that the United States will continue to have the most lethal military in the world. I've talked about this with friends. We all have shared the moment when we cringed and said, "What?" Because I guess we had some belief that peace was possible, that perhaps having a woman in charge would mean things were different. But as Riane Eisler says, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. It's partnership. And our potential future president does not work under the partnership model. She works underneath what Riane Eisler also calls the domination model. And that is a mighty uncomfortable thing. although it's certainly something we've grown quite accustomed to in the modern world. So when I think about Mongin and power, and I'd love for you to go back and listen to my original story and really think about the ways in which power is constantly being offered, brokered, disrupted, reimagined, propagandized. It's a moment to really think about these stories and how our relationship to power is still so out of joint. And there's another reason that this story was hard to tell this week. And that's because, well, a member of the class of 1997 from Barnstable High School died this week. Now, why it's particularly relevant that somebody I haven't seen in close to 30 years has passed away and why that would disrupt my entire creative week, well, it's the way he died and why he died. Matthew Nelson, we all knew him as Matt, self-immolated in front of the Israeli consulate in Boston on September 11th. He set himself afire in order to protest the death of the people of Gaza, in order to protest the ways in which United States citizens were all complicit in the arming of the people who were killing the innocents. I only found out about this not because it made news, but because one of our classmates is a reporter, and she was looking for stories not of how Matt died, but of who he was when he lived. It was rather mysterious, and so I Googled it, and then I found the video, and then I realized that it was all over many of the Instagram accounts of the activist organizations that I follow, but somehow I'd missed it. But once I heard his voice, once I saw his face, I remembered that guy that I'd gone to elementary school with, that I'd gone to CCD with, and had spent all the time in the Our Lady of Victory church basement with. I remember the guy who wore the Grateful Dead t-shirts in high school, who I probably didn't speak to much at all. But still, I knew that voice. And when I heard him speaking in even, sorrowful tones about what he believes in, my heart broke. And suddenly, what we've been so transfixed by as a nation and as a world for nearly a year came home in a crushing, crushing way. And what was even more crushing is that this act of most extreme civil disobedience is meant to be witnessed. It's meant to be a force for change. And I don't think anybody knows about it. Yes, those do inside the activist communities, but it didn't make the news, and it still hasn't made the news. And to me, that's one of the greatest heartbreaks of all, is that in the United States, we still refuse to see. We refuse to have the most difficult conversations about why it just might be time to reverse decades of policy. And how can we figure out a way to stop the killing without alienating and vilifying all Jewish people? Because this is, in fact, a deeply complex issue, and that is why it is so intractable. And it is complex due to identity and due to history and due to grief and due to the sense that there are those who feel more comfortable in working in moral absolutes than in all the shades of gray of our reality. And when we are confronted with the absolute of someone setting themselves on fire, we do not know what to do with it. And so we turn away. Does this have anything directly to do with the story of Mongin, an Irish sovereignty goddess turned queen turned witch? It's probably a stretch. But in this case, the story and the events of the day are held together by me, the storyteller, and by you, because you are here to witness both of them sitting beside each other. We tell stories in order to remember. We tell stories in order to find a cohesive narrative in a world that does not seem to have one. We tell stories in order to make meaning and find meaning, and we take great risk when we do that because we could get it wrong. Willfully, accidentally, because we are beings full of emotion, so desperate to find the connections. So this week, I offer you a replay of a story I've told before with an introduction that I hope makes some sort of coherent sense, that I hope honors the life of a man that I haven't seen in 30 years, but to say, we saw what you did. We are full of sorrow and grief and confusion, that we live in a world that you are in a place where you felt that was your next best option. We see the people who are suffering that you could not unsee. And so, with that, a story that will take you to another world, a story that I hope may have some sort of echoes for you in this world, so that allows you to look at something in your life in a different way, from a different angle, with a greater degree of nuance. This story is in many ways about balance and what happens when that balance is disrupted. It feels as if balance is utterly elusive to us right now. When we live in a polarized country, when we live in polarized times, when we know that we've hit so many tipping points when it comes to the environment, when we fear that we've hit so many tipping points when it comes to issues of community and knitting together some sort of society in which people can find a way to agree to partnership rather than dominance and annihilation. The Last Sovereignty Goddess. Then, on the eve of Samhain precisely, Mungin dies. So this is the death of Mungin the Banshee. Hence, Samhain is called by the rabble Mungin's feast, for she was a witch and had magical power while she was in the flesh. Wherefore, women and the rabble make petitions to her on Samhain. That is how the story ends. It's time you know how the story began. My name is Mungin, and if I am remembered, my name is tangled in lies of intrigue, deceit, and murder. In fact, my story is one of origins, union, and mystery. There are truths here, but let it be said that this is a story that emerged from the imaginal realm. Mythic truths emerge in many shapes across time. First, you must know this. When the call comes, you do not refuse it. I was raised for this sacred work. All of my sisters, all of us Ini and Danu, daughters of Danu, were raised to cross the veil and weave the worlds together. We dwelt in the vault beneath the twin mountains of Mother Danu's breasts. Our home was the womb space beneath the surface where the sun never penetrates, yet the night sky always shines. We were creatures of deepest earth. From the very beginning, we lived amongst the stars. But, of course, we were made of the stuff of stars. There was a sacred sort of routine, albeit an unpredictable one. One of the sisters was called forth when a true king died, and the land cried out for a new ruler. The land herself had needs, and she needed a man who possessed the gift of vervlagement, the truth of the heart. The man would love the land and serve as the land's beloved. This man would be king, and he would be the protector and sovereign who would tend to her sacred body, feed her cherished people, and promised balance in the herds, the groves, and amongst all wild things. The chosen sister would emerge from our mountain to attend to her duty. Sometimes all the people, everyone in the tribe, the Tua, would gather for the Banish Rigi, the sacred marriage and the blessing of the king. But it all depended on the daughter of Danu to pass the cup and welcome the new ruler into her own sacred body. As we had been taught, the sister would take on all the power and magic of the goddess of sovereignty herself. She would anoint the worthy one with the mother's own kiss and hold him with her own arms and thighs. Forever leaving our otherworldly home in the belly of the mountain, she would devote herself to this man and his Tua. She surrendered her divinity to the whole beautiful, desperate, fragile enterprise of humanity. Though we would never get over the homesickness for the sisterhood, we never begrudged this work that took us from them. We missed our mountain with its holy shadow ceiling that hung with the heavens. But we learned to bloom beneath the changing skies that only offered us the fire of the stars for half of each turn of the earth, for half of each day. We were here to learn the ways of the sun, and we accepted its warmth and its harsh light in equal measure. Sometimes the union of goddess and king was a great communal festival. Sometimes there was simply a woman, a man, and a single sip of water. When I was called to the well. Now, they don't just set a sovereignty goddess in a clearing and pass the could-be king a map to find her, you know. There's wayfinding to be done and tests to be administered before an earthly queen is crowned. Sacred daughters of Danu are formless mountain spirits until they are born to your world and take the dry, bent form of the holy crone. Yes, we age in reverse. But that is the least of the mysteries of this tale, don't you think? I took my first newborn earthly breath through cracked, creased lips, wind whistling through teeth broken by a lifetime of gnawing bones from every steer I had never eaten. My skeleton ached as I felt the weight of age like a crush of a hammer on Bridget's anvil. But sure, I just thought this was what all humanity had to bear. I was but an infant Kalyak, and I had unspeakable miles to walk before I'd reach that blessed well to meet my prince. Since the dawn of sacred time, I had lived in the belly of the land, but I'd never walked the green fields or wrapped my arms around a mighty oak. And a queen-to-be must know her land as well as she knows her own flesh. I moved this new and ancient body of mine on swollen feet and felt an unaccustomed thing, sweat trickling between my own drooping breasts. The sun, when it shone, burned my crooked nose. I felt the cold rain on my own hard head, those sparse gray hairs of mine, not enough to keep me dry. It was a long road, walking those rocky places where the limestone and sandstone and siltstone spines of Mother Ireland shone through. I loved those hard gray places most of all, but I could not stay and make my home amongst the stones. Not yet. But oh, as I walked, I missed the mountain womb cave. I knew I was not here to stay in my native elements of fire and stone. I needed to pick up a cup of water for a man who breathed the breath of a king. I reached the grove with its deep, deep well at the heart of the dense, dense wood. And I waited. It took time, but such is the nature of a Kalyak woman born of fire from the heart of stone. And in time, he came. There's a sense that the sovereignty goddess is changed with the choosing of the king. We'd hear tell of some of the sisters selecting a partner from amongst a crowd of ardent suitors and vying warriors. I had no interest in such games. When a single man came into my grove and seemed quite sure of his right to be there, I trusted that his own journey to my side was sign of his worthiness. I was so relieved he'd finally come, as I'd grown lonesome here, all by myself, beneath the changing sky. I was sure he'd proven himself if he'd gotten this far. I was sure I could see in him the truth of his kingly heart. Only later would I doubt myself. Only later would I curse my own divine youth, callow and untested. Only later would I wonder if it was loneliness and impatience that drove me into his arms. Remember, beyond my appearance, I was a newborn babe who knew nothing of a man's guile and the way his eyes can shine when he sees what he wants. I knew nothing of the machinations of statecraft, and I did not yet even possess a human heart. I was raised to speak the language of the stars. I sought not power, but divine union. My bedtime stories in what you might call goddess school in the mother mountain womb were of imbus and dawn, inspiration and poetry. If I could go back now, I would have a chat with the matron about updating the curriculum and giving the sovereign's bride a few more real-world skills. But how could she have known? How could any of us? We didn't realize how a marriage of the two worlds had been built on a cracked foundation. We didn't realize how greed could stretch across lifetimes and that mankind would someday have the hubris to change the rules. We just knew that our mother island could survive anything for the lifetime of one human man. After all, she always had. And so I followed my otherworldly instincts, and with honor and devotion, I gave the gifts of my divine world to the world of the mortal. With a voice I'd never used, my walk across Eru had been a solitary one. I told the young man with his sea gray eyes and fine dun-colored hair that he could have his sip of water and his seat of kingship, if first he would prove himself worthy and give me my due. This was ritual theater, with only the eyes of the trees and the ears of the earth as audience. My sisters and the man's ancestors had engaged in this scripted, secret dance since men had first set foot on this land. It always seemed a strange custom to me. And it was even as I acted in the play, feeling a million leagues away from my frail, cold body as that great hulk of a man came close. But still, it had something of the oldest magic about it. Some other time I will tell you of the sons of Mill and that man they called the poet Amergin, who first approached my many times great aunties, Banva, Fola, and Eru, and flirted and flattered himself into a deal that set men on their thrones and sent us, the two a day, to the belly beneath the mountain breasts of Mama Danu. Of course, that story had its share of betrayal and battle, but now is not the day. We are here to remember my story and my name. Yoki took the deal, though he didn't offer his name or ask me mine until much later. He pressed his thirst-dried lips to my own age-dried mouth. I was breathless from the great broad warmth of him. I felt my own sinews rub against my bones and felt what it must be to be swallowed by flesh and wanting. His wanting, his lust made certain by his trust in the lore that told him what awaited on the other side of this stomach-curdling first kiss. I felt myself grow smaller and smaller in his grip, all my fire and stars dissolving in his wet mouth and hot breath. But then there was a shift, a green gold shoot of all the promises of all our shared beliefs that were rooted into the very moment when his ancestors met mine. He knew his kiss was the magic that would release my magic, all golden hair and grass-green eyes, all swan-white skin and firm breasts, all rosebud mouth pulled from the wicked crone's maw. By meeting the wasted sovereignty goddess and taking her as she was, he was taking the sovereignty into himself, but only so he could return it to me. With that kiss, he was making me anew, passing back the power and the knowledge I'd conveyed to him. And so I hoped, I expected, we'd be locked in this cycle, sharing wisdom, love, and power forever. All queen, all king, all hail the queen who made the king, who was made by the king. The king is born, the king-making queen is born. Ri, Banrian, Banashrigi, Ruga on Ri, Ruga on Banrian. Yes, yes, yes. And both our hearts were going like mad, and I said yes. I took on his knowledge and his power, and I found my own new sense of sovereignty beating in a chest that suddenly held an unscarred human heart, aged backwards from otherworldly wisdom to a new queen's magic and might. I could now see a man with wise enough eyes, a sure enough grip, a kind enough mouth. At that moment, as I threaded ungnarled fingers through his thick beard, I thought all that enoughness was enough. Only later would I see. He would hold the throne and keep the peace. The herds would grow, the bellies would fill. But at a price. This man's price was women and slaves, and I would not have the power to free our lives of either. I loved him true, despite these flaws. He loved our land with his whole being, and he reached to me around these flaws, around the great gulf that would always sit at the core of our true union. And it would be enough, for his lifetime at least. But then, there were those cracks in the bedrock. I don't like to think it came from me or my star-seed cavern home, though our mountain was riddled with all sorts of caves and crevices and sacred voids that would make you think twice about the solidity of earth and stone. The stories they'd tell would surely cast me as a holy terror in my own right. They said I was jealous and power-hungry. That wasn't it, but surely I made some disastrous misstep. Was my crime not being discerning enough? Not taking upon myself the power of choice? Was I supposed to wait for other possible sovereigns to enter my grove? Was I too innocent and sure that any man who came to me with a tender touch would be a creature of pure love? It may have been bigger than me altogether, though. A long, slow erosion of our balance. The daughters of Danu and the sons of men. Our arrangement, where they had dominion over every plain, seashore, peak, and riverbed, while we were exiled to our realm beneath mountain and mound. Reciprocity, living with our own share of creation threads, clutched in the hand, woven in equal measure, fitcha fuacha. Sadly, that was no longer the way it worked after all those centuries of king-making and power brokering. And so, I was the last sovereignty goddess that Ireland ever knew. And my name, Mungin, has been all but forgotten. Sure, if you know my name at all, you'll know me as the evil stepmother type, as the nasty from noble Niall's tale. You'll hear how my stepson met the hag at the well and how he'd swept her into his arms to become sovereign of sovereigns, ensuring his Inail dynasty a seat at the head of the table for centuries. Now, I've already spun that whole story for those who would care to hear the truth of it all, with all of its he said, she said, he cheated and she poured the poison glory. I will not waste what breath I have to tell you the tale of what was not my own defeat, but the defeat of the entire balance of the children of the goddess and the children of men, the sacred balance of love and power between the worlds. For this story, it is enough to say that the shape-shifting hag at the well, the one they say that Niall kissed, it's enough to say that she was mere invention. She was a finely crafted piece of propaganda invented by the cleverest political minds of the time. Niall and my sons never met anyone at the well. But Niall did listen carefully to his father's stories and how his kingship and our courtship were so divinely aligned. Stories are powerful, remember. I think you like to celebrate the transformative power of story in your time. But never forget, it's a rare sort of power that is exercised with pure intentions. It's a rare sort of story that isn't told to shape the reality of the moment. Once more, I'll repeat the story they tell. Then, on the eve of Samhain precisely, Mungin dies. So this is the death of Mungin the Banshee. Hence, Samhain is called by the rabble Mungin's feast, for she was a witch and had magical power while she was in the flesh. Wherefore, women and the rabble make petitions to her on Samhain. Here's how I would have you understand my epitaph. Do remember me as you pass through the Samhain portal, when you stand in the liminal space between the harvest of the autumn equinox and the moment of the light's return at the winter solstice. This is the moment when I, a banshee, not a harbinger of death, but a woman of the she, could return to my mother Danu's womb beneath the breasted mountains. And do remember that those who have been labeled witch are, so often, just following the call of their own destiny, doing the divine work of keeping together body and soul and keeping the worlds in balance. Be you a woman or a member of the rabble, one of the ordinary folk, those who live close to the earth and close to the mother, remember me. Remember with me. Have the courage to see we live in the times of tilted scales, the sacred balance destroyed by corrupted counselors and self-serving kingmakers, by those who think we live by man's laws and whims alone. But, even more important, remember what came before and could come again. The divine union of the seen and unseen, the infinite dance between the realm of spirit and the gorgeous riot of every created thing. Thank you for tuning in to the KnotWork Storytelling Podcast. Please subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform, and do share this episode with other lovers of myth and story. By the way, everyone is a lover of myth and story, even if they've forgotten. Creating this show is a labor of love, and your support will help me continue to craft and share stories through this season and beyond. Please consider becoming a subscriber to my paid newsletter, Myth is Medicine. You'll find it on Substack, and that's where all my newest writing and occasional bonus podcasts can be found. You can learn more about my writing, my book, our online creative community, The Writer's Knot, as well as how to work with me as a writing coach over at marisagowdy.com. Gratefully, I live, write, work, and record this podcast on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, whose name means original people.